Students, welcome to the screencast for our study of elections. You'll notice at the top of the page here that we are working on Unit 6 and Target 8. So we want to talk about elections today, and we want to look at how they work, how they're set up, some of the terminology we use to describe how officials in our government are elected. First thing we need to do is start out with the terms of office. So we're going to start out with how many years an elected official is in office. So let's start out with the president, and I would assume most of you know that a president serves a 4-year term. Okay. A president is also limited to 2 terms. So he serves 4 years per term, but he's limited to 2 terms. And that was that came about in the early 1950s with the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. This came in response largely to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected to an unprecedented 4 terms. That was the first time any president had actually been elected in more than 2 terms, and that happened with FDR starting in 1932. And he was elected to 4 terms, the last one being 1944, and then, of course, if you remember from history, he died shortly after taking office or resuming office after his 4th election. With members of the House, they serve a 2-year term. Members of the Senate serve a 6-year term, and these are all provided for in the Constitution. Neither the House nor the Senate have any term limits. A number of years ago, there was a little bit of a movement among the states to limit members of their own congressional delegation to a certain number of terms, and that was actually declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And if you were going to do that, you would have to do it through a constitutional amendment, just like took place with limiting presidential terms. Now, these terms come into this picture when we talk about elections a little bit later on, and it'll make more sense why we talked about terms. Okay, over on the right here, we want to introduce you to what are known as election cycles. There are actually 2 types of election cycles. The first type is what we call a presidential election cycle. The next type is what we call a midterm election. And as you could probably guess, a presidential election cycle is during an election where we elect a president. A midterm election cycle comes in the middle of the presidential term. So again, go back and remember, go back to our terms of office here, just so you can kind of see how this works. Of course, a president is elected during a presidential election cycle, but so are members of the House. Again, remember, members of the House actually have to run for re-election every 2 years. So every presidential election cycle, members of the House have to run for their office. The Senate, members of the House also, I should mention, have to run in midterm election cycles because these come every 2 years. Senators may run or may be required to run in a midterm election. Let me try that arrow again. It just depends on their seats, because the Constitution actually staggers the Senate into 3 groups, and they have to be elected in 2-year cycles so that no state has both of their senators come up for re-election in any given election cycle. Okay, now in addition to election cycles, we want to talk just a little bit about two types of election seasons. And both midterm and presidential elections have these election seasons. There are two types. There is what we call the primary season, and what we call simply the general season. In the primary season, you have candidates who run for that party's they run for the office for that party. So take for example, let's take for example the 2012 primary season. And you have the Republicans, you have the Democrats. So you may or may not recognize some of these names, but let's go over a few of the candidates that ran in the primaries in 2012. As you probably know, in 2012, Mitt Romney was a candidate. Of course, he ends up winning the Republican primary. But you also had other individuals such as Ron Paul, Newt Gingrich, who used to be the Speaker of the House back in the 1990s. And there are others. I'll just give you one more. Rick Perry, who was, or I should say is, the governor of Texas. So those were some of the top candidates for the Republicans, and they are competing against each other. Okay? Now on the Democratic side, of course you have Barack Obama. Now what's interesting about the 2012 election is there's really no one of any consequence that ran against Barack Obama because he's what we call the incumbent. The incumbent is simply a term describing an elected official who is seeking their office again, who's already been in there. So he's the incumbent. And again, he didn't really have anybody of consequence to run against him, so he was really the only person running for the Democratic nomination. Okay. Now back in 2008, it was a little bit different. You also have Mitt Romney and others running on the Republican side, but on the Democratic side, there was a pretty stiff competition between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. I'm sure most of you recognize that name. All right, so now we have this the kind of framework here for what we're trying to do. Again, terms of office, election cycles, two types, presidential elections and midterms, and then we have what we might call election seasons. There are two types of those, the primary and the general election season. Okay, I think the best way to show you how this works is to actually have a kind of a timeline. So we're going to actually start out with the timeline that goes back to the 2008 election cycle. What I want to do here is I want to just kind of show you visually or graphically how this works. So the 2008 election cycle, we'll just draw a little bracket here to show you how this works. Again, this would be a presidential election cycle. because the president is being elected in 2008. Fix that just a little bit. All right, remember there are two kinds of election cycles. We have presidential elections, so let's move over to this next part of the timeline. And here we have a midterm election cycle. You'll notice I'm going just a little bit over into the next year because that's when the elected officials actually take office. So again, this is a midterm election cycle here. Again, let's move down on the next or the last part of the timeline. Again, we have a presidential election cycle, the 2012 presidential election cycle. Draw that down to 2013. Okay, anyway, hopefully you get the picture. They kind of leapfrog. Again, every 2 years we have either a presidential election cycle or a midterm election cycle.